She woke up before the sun did. 4:30 in the morning. The kind of dark that sits heavy on your chest. The kind of silence that only exists when the rest of the world is still dreaming. But Margaret wasn't dreaming. Margaret was already tying her apron strings, already pulling the good roasting pan from the bottom cabinet, already whispering a quiet prayer over a kitchen that had been hers for 31 years. She didn't need an alarm. Her body knew. It had always known. This was Christmas morning, and in this house, Christmas morning meant something. It meant the smell of cinnamon and cloves creeping under every door. It meant the turkey going in early, the cranberry sauce made from scratch, the pies that had been cooling on the counter since the night before. It meant love, expressed the only way Margaret had ever truly known how, through feeding people, through showing up, through never, not once, letting anyone at her table go home hungry. She moved through that kitchen the way a conductor moves through an orchestra, confident, purposeful. Every burner had a job. Every timer had a reason. The sweet potatoes needed exactly 40 minutes. The green bean casserole had to go in last. The gravy, her mother's gravy, the recipe written on a folded piece of paper so old the ink had faded to a whisper. That needed watching. That always needed watching. She had done this for 31 years, and she would do it today. But here is what Margaret did not know, standing there in her kitchen at 4:30 in the morning, stirring and seasoning and humming softly to herself. She did not know that before this day was over, she would be pushed to a place she had never been pushed before. She did not know that the table she was cooking for, the table she had hosted every single Christmas since 1993, would become a battleground. She did not know that someone would look her in the eye, in her own home, and suggest, calmly, almost sweetly, that maybe she should eat upstairs. She did not know that her entire life, everything she had built and sacrificed and poured herself into, was about to be tested in front of a room full of people. And she did not know that she was going to pass that test in a way nobody in that room would ever forget. But before we get there, if you are new here, welcome. And if you have been with us for a while, you already know that this channel is the place where real stories live. Stories about dignity, about quiet strength, about the moments that define us when everything is on the line. If that speaks to something in you, take a second right now and hit that subscribe button, because what is coming in this story is going to stay with you long after it is over. And for those of you watching, whether you found us on Facebook, YouTube, or somewhere else entirely, drop a comment below and tell us where you are watching from. We love knowing where in the world our family is sitting. Now, back to Margaret. Her son's name was Dominic, 34 years old, broad-shouldered, with his father's eyes and his mother's stubbornness, though he would never admit to the second part. Dominic had married a woman named Celeste 3 years ago, and Margaret had tried. She had genuinely, sincerely, with her whole heart tried. She had welcomed Celeste into this house. She had asked about her family, her preferences, her comfort. She had moved the good dishes from the high shelf to the low one, because Celeste had mentioned, once, casually, that she liked to help set the table. Small things, quiet accommodations, the kind of adjustments you make when you love your child and you want his marriage to work. But Celeste was a particular kind of woman, the kind who redecorates a room by first making you feel like your taste was always slightly wrong. The kind who volunteers to organize something and then, once organized, acts as though it was always hers. She never raised her voice. She never said anything that could be clearly directly called unkind. She operated in a register just below confrontation, in suggestions, in size, in the careful placement of words that left you wondering, afterward, whether you had imagined it. Margaret had not imagined it. The first year, Celeste had suggested that perhaps the Christmas decorations were a little vintage. The second year, she had mentioned that some of the guests might prefer a more intimate setting, and somehow that had translated into Celeste personally rearranging the seating at the dining table Margaret had owned for 20 years. By the third year, which was this year, Celeste had stopped suggesting and started deciding. She had invited 8 of her own friends to Christmas dinner. Not family, friends, to Margaret's house, without asking. Dominic had told his mother about it 2 days before, standing in the kitchen with the look of a man who had already lost the argument he was about to make. He said Celeste thought it would be nice to expand the circle. He said it with the careful tone of someone reading from a script they did not write. Margaret had looked at her son for a long moment. She had seen the apology in his eyes that his mouth was not saying, and she had nodded because she loved him, and because she was not the kind of woman who made her child choose. But she had felt it, that small, cold shift, the feeling of something being taken that no one was officially taking. She turned back to her stove and said nothing. And this morning, at 4:30 while Celeste slept, Margaret cooked. She cooked for all of them, for Dominic and Celeste and their 8 guests, and her daughter Renata, who was driving in from 3 hours away, and old Uncle Flavio, who always cried at Christmas dinner, and swore he had something in his eye. She cooked for all of them the way she had always cooked, completely, without reservation, holding nothing back, because that was who she was, because this was her house, and because somewhere deep in the place where dignity lives, she already knew that today was going to require everything she had. By 9 in the morning, the house smelled like Christmas had a heartbeat. The turkey was golden and breathing in the oven. The cranberry sauce had set perfectly in its dish, deep red and jewel bright, catching the light from the kitchen window like something precious. The pies, 2 apple, 1 pecan, 1 sweet potato, stood on the counter in a row, like quiet monuments to everything Margaret believed in. The table was set. The good tablecloth, the ivory one with the embroidered edges that had belonged to her mother, was pressed and laid perfectly flat. The crystal glasses her late husband Bernard had bought her for their 10th anniversary stood at every place sitting, sparkling like they were trying to earn their keep. Margaret had done all of this alone. She had not asked for help, partly because asking was not her nature, and partly because she knew no help was coming. Dominic and Celeste were still upstairs. She had heard movement up there around 8, the soft thud of feet on floorboards, the murmur of voices, the sound of a shower running, but no one had come down to the kitchen. No one had appeared in the doorway to say good morning, or to ask what needed doing, or to simply stand beside her, the way her own mother used to stand beside her grandmother. Not always useful, but always present. She told herself it did not matter. She told herself this while refolding a napkin that was already folded correctly. Renata arrived first, at 10:15, blowing through the front door with cold air and 3 bags of things nobody asked her to bring, and an energy that immediately made the house feel more like itself. Renata was Margaret's daughter, 50 years old, with silver-streaked hair she refused to dye and opinions she refused to soften. And she was the kind of person who could read a room the way other people read a book, quickly, completely, and with full retention of every detail. She walked into the kitchen, looked at her mother, looked at the spread on the counter, looked at the set table visible through the doorway, and said, "You've been up since 4, haven't you?" It was not a question. Margaret smiled and handed her a cup of coffee. Renata took it, leaned against the counter, and lowered her voice. "How many people is Celeste bringing?" 8. A pause. 8 of her people. Her friends, yes. Renata wrapped both hands around the coffee cup and looked at the ceiling with the expression of a woman doing very controlled breathing. Then she looked back at her mother. "And you cooked for all of them?" "It's Christmas," Margaret said simply. This was the thing about Margaret that people who did not know her sometimes mistook for passivity. It was not passivity. It was something much harder to achieve and much more difficult to dismantle. It was a kind of bedrock certainty about who she was and what she stood for, a certainty so deep it did not need to be announced or defended. She had cooked because cooking was love, and she gave her love without requiring the recipient to deserve it first. That was her choice. That was her strength. But even bedrock has a surface, and surfaces can be scratched. Celeste's guests began arriving at noon. They came in pairs and small clusters, stylish and loud and comfortable in the way people are comfortable when they feel they belong somewhere. They hung their coats without being shown where to hang them. They drifted into the living room and rearranged themselves on Margaret's furniture with the ease of people who had been told, in advance, that this was an easy, casual gathering. One woman complimented the pie on the counter and then turned to Celeste to say she must have been baking all morning. Celeste smiled and said it had been quite an effort. Margaret, standing 6 feet away, heard this clearly. She said nothing. She turned back to her gravy. Renata, from across the room, caught her mother's eye. Margaret gave the smallest possible shake of her head. "Not here. Not now. Let it go. Dominic came downstairs at 12:30, freshly dressed, and did the thing he had been doing for 3 years now, when he walked into a room that contained both his mother and his wife. He moved toward the center, toward neutral ground, with the careful navigation of a man who had learned that choosing a side, even accidentally, had consequences. He kissed his mother on the cheek. He squeezed her shoulder. He said the food smelled incredible, and he meant it. She could tell he meant it. But there was something exhausted in his eyes that had not been there 5 years ago. Something worn, like a path that has been walked too many times in the same direction. She patted his hand. She told him to go be with his guests. At 1 o'clock, Margaret untied her apron for the first time all day. She hung it on its hook by the stove, the hook Bernard had installed 30 years ago, at exactly the right height. And she smoothed down her blouse and touched her hair and looked at the table she had set and the food she had made and felt, despite everything, a deep and quiet pride. This was good work, honest work, the kind of work that asked nothing back. She walked toward the dining room. The table was full of voices and movement. Celeste's friends finding their seats, pulling out chairs, someone laughing at something on the far end. Margaret moved toward the head of the table. The head of the table where she had sat every Christmas for 31 years, where Bernard had sat beside her, where her children had grown up, year after year, in the warmth of this exact room. She reached for the chair, and that was when she heard it. Celeste's voice, light and unbothered, floating across the noise of the room like it was the most natural thing in the world. "Oh, Margaret, maybe you should eat upstairs. It might be more comfortable for you up there. We have quite a crowd down here." The room did not go silent immediately. It took 2 or 3 seconds, the way a stone takes a moment to sink after it hits the water. One by one, conversations stuttered and stopped. Heads turned, eyes moved from Celeste to Margaret and back again. And Margaret stood at the head of her table, in her house, with her hand on the back of her chair, and felt something shift inside her. Not break, shift. There is a moment that comes to certain people, usually the ones who have spent a lifetime being quietly strong, when something inside them stops bending. Not breaks, not snaps, not explodes. Those are violent words, and this was not a violent moment. It was something quieter, and in many ways more powerful than violence. It was the moment when a person who has spent decades absorbing, accommodating, adjusting, and making space for everyone else suddenly becomes completely, absolutely, unmovably still, like a tree that has swayed in the wind for 30 years and then one morning simply decides it is done swaying. Margaret stood at the head of her table and felt that stillness move through her from her feet to the top of her head. The room was watching. Celeste was still smiling. That particular smile that was not quite warm and not quite cold, the smile that existed in the careful middle distance where nothing could be pinned on it. She had a glass of something sparkling in her hand, and her posture was relaxed, and she looked, to anyone observing, like a woman who had simply made a practical suggestion to an older relative. Reasonable, even considerate. Perhaps upstairs would be quieter. Perhaps it would be more comfortable. Perhaps, the smile implied, Margaret was simply not quite suited to a gathering this lively. 8 strangers watched from their seats. Renata, standing near the kitchen doorway, had gone very still in a different way, the stillness of someone who is deciding whether to step forward or wait. Her eyes were fixed on her mother with an intensity that could have bent metal. Dominic was at the far end of the table. Margaret could see him without looking directly at him, the way mothers always see their children, peripherally, instinctively, always. He had heard it. Of course he had heard it. The whole room had heard it. His face was doing something complicated, a series of small expressions moving through it too fast to name, and his hands, she noticed, were flat on the table in front of him, pressed down, as if he was keeping himself in his seat through deliberate effort. Margaret looked at Celeste. Not with anger. People would later try to describe what was in Margaret's eyes in that moment, and they would all reach for the same word and then pull back from it, because it seemed too simple, too soft for what it actually was. The word they kept almost using was dignity. But it was more than that. It was the look of a woman who has finally, completely, run out of the particular kind of patience that asks nothing in return. The patience that absorbs and forgives and makes space and expects nothing back. That patience was gone, and what had replaced it was not rage, it was clarity. Margaret's hand, which had been resting on the back of the chair, now gripped it. Not tensely, firmly, the way you grip something that belongs to you. She pulled the chair out. She sat down, at the head of her table, in her house, on Christmas morning, after 8.5 hours of cooking, before a single guest had opened their eyes. She sat down in that chair with the particular grace of a woman who has decided, quietly and permanently, that she is done standing at the edges of her own life. The room was completely silent now. Celeste's smile had not disappeared, but it had changed shape. It was thinner now, uncertain at the edges, like a garment that has been cut for a different body. She had expected, Margaret understood, one of several possible responses. She had expected fluster, perhaps, or a quiet retreat, or maybe a tight-lipped compliance dressed up as cheerfulness, the way Margaret had responded to 100 other small diminishments over 3 years. She had not expected this. This calm, this absolute, grounded, immovable calm. Margaret reached forward and placed her napkin in her lap. Then she looked up, and she looked around the table, and she spoke. Not loudly. Margaret had never needed volume. Her voice was clear and steady, and it carried the way voices carry when they come from somewhere true. She said, "My name is Margaret. This is my home. I have lived here for 31 years. This table was a gift from my late husband Bernard on our 15th wedding anniversary. I have hosted Christmas in this room every single year since 1993. And this morning, I began cooking at 4:30 so that every person at this table would have a meal worth remembering." She paused, not for effect, simple because the next part needed its own space. "I am going to sit here at the head of my table, and I am going to enjoy the meal I made. And I want every one of you to enjoy it too. That is why I made it." She looked then briefly at Celeste, just briefly, long enough. "Everyone is welcome at my table," she said. Everyone. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the one that had come before. The first silence had been shock. This one was something closer to reckoning. The kind of quiet that falls when something true has been said in a room that had been getting comfortable with something false. One of Celeste's friends, a woman named Portia, who had been sitting 2 seats down with her sparkling water halfway to her lips, set her glass down very carefully on the table. Another guest, a man named Theodore, who had been in the middle of unfolding his napkin, finished unfolding it and placed it in his lap without a word, with the focused attention of someone who needs something to do with their hands. Renata moved. She walked from the kitchen doorway to the table and sat down in her seat with a composure that was its own kind of statement. She reached over and touched her mother's hand once, quickly, and then she picked up her fork and said in a perfectly normal voice, "The cranberry sauce looks incredible this year, Mom." And Margaret said, "I added a little orange zest, something new." And just like that, the meal began. It did not begin easily. The first few minutes were careful, tentative, the conversational equivalent of testing ice before you walk on it. But Margaret was a woman who knew how to hold a room without dominating it. She asked Portia where she was from. She passed dishes and filled glasses and remembered names after hearing them once, because she had always been good with names, because she had always believed that remembering someone's name was the smallest possible form of telling them they mattered. And slowly, the way warmth always moves through a cold room if the source is steady enough, the table came alive. Not because the tension had been resolved. It hadn't. There was something unfinished in the room, something that sat between Celeste and the chair at the head of the table like a word that hadn't been said yet. But Margaret had done something that could not be undone. She had named the room. She had named herself in it. And that naming had shifted the weight of everything. Dominic, from his end of the table, looked at his mother with an expression she recognized. She had seen it on his face when he was 7 years old, and had watched her handle something difficult with a grace he couldn't yet name. He had that same look now, older, more complicated, weighted with things he would need to reckon with privately in his own time. But underneath all of it, the same thing that had always been there. He was proud of her. He was also, she could see, beginning to understand something he had perhaps been avoiding for 3 years. Margaret took her first bite of turkey. Of course, it was. The meal unfolded the way good meals do, when the food is honest, and the hands that made it meant every single thing they put into it. Dishes moved around the table in both directions, passed hand to hand, and with each passing, something imperceptible but real was being exchanged alongside the sweet potatoes and the stuffing and the green bean casserole that had come out exactly right. Portia asked for the cranberry sauce twice. Theodore had 3 helpings of turkey and looked faintly embarrassed about the third one, until Margaret told him that a third helping was the highest compliment a cook could receive. And he laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of him, and took a fourth. The table loosened. Conversations found their rhythm. Someone told a story about a disastrous Thanksgiving from years ago involving a smoke alarm and a frozen turkey, and the kind of cascading domestic catastrophe that is only funny in retrospect. And the whole table laughed together, the way people laugh when they have forgotten, briefly, to be performing. Margaret laughed too. This was the thing about her that Celeste had perhaps never quite understood, and could not have predicted. Margaret was not a martyr. She was not sitting at the head of that table nursing a wound or building a case or waiting for an apology. She was having Christmas dinner. She was doing the thing she had done every year for 3 decades, which was taking a collection of human beings, some of whom loved each other and some of whom barely knew each other, and feeding them until they felt like a family. That was her gift. That was what she did. And no amount of quiet diminishment, no carefully worded suggestion about eating upstairs, could reach down deep enough to take that from her. But the table had not forgotten what happened before the meal began. It lived in the room the way certain things live in rooms, not spoken, but present. Portia, who turned out to be a warmer and more perceptive woman than her entrance had suggested, had positioned herself in the conversation in a way that kept drawing Margaret in, kept directing attention toward her, kept creating small, natural moments for her voice to be the one the table was listening to. Whether this was conscious or instinctive, Margaret couldn't tell, but she noticed it, and she was quietly grateful for it. Celeste was eating. She was participating in conversations. She was smiling at the right moments and laughing at the right moments and doing everything a person does when they are performing normalcy over the top of something uncomfortable. But she had not looked directly at Margaret since the moment Margaret sat down. Not once. And her glass, Margaret noticed, had been refilled several times. Dominic was watching his wife the way you watch a weather system you are not sure about. He was also watching his mother. He was a man suspended between 2 gravitational forces, and Margaret could see the toll it was taking on him, had been taking on him, probably for longer than today. She felt for him. She genuinely felt for him, because she knew what it was to love someone who made things complicated, and she knew that love does not come with an off switch, and she knew that whatever reckoning was coming for Dominic and Celeste was not hers to force or accelerate. That was their marriage. That was their work to do. Her work was this table. After the main course was cleared, Margaret stood to clear it, and 3 of Celeste's friends immediately stood with her, carrying plates to the kitchen, with the slightly overeager helpfulness of people who feel they owe a debt they cannot quite name. Margaret brought out the pies. All 4 of them, on a large wooden board Bernard had made in his workshop the winter before he got sick. She set it in the center of the table, and the reaction was immediate and unanimous. Someone said, "Oh my goodness." Someone else said she was not going to be able to drive home. Theodore leaned forward and looked at the pecan pie with an expression of open, uncomplicated longing that made half the table smile. Margaret cut the first slice and held it out. She held it out to Celeste. The table went quiet in that specific way again, not the shocked silence of before, but something more delicate, more watchful. Celeste looked at the plate. She looked at Margaret's hand, holding it steady across the table, toward her. She looked up at Margaret's face, and whatever she had been prepared to find there, satisfaction perhaps, or coldness, or the particular smugness of someone who has won something, she did not find it. What she found was simply Margaret, open, steady, unhurried Margaret, holding a slice of pecan pie toward her daughter-in-law on Christmas afternoon, with the same uncomplicated generosity with which she had made every single thing on this table since 4:30 in the morning. Something moved across Celeste's face. It was quick. She controlled it quickly. But it was there, and Portia saw it, and Renata saw it, and Margaret saw it, and Dominic, watching from his end of the table, saw it too, and felt something unlock in his chest that had been locked for a very long time. Celeste took the plate. She said quietly, almost inaudibly beneath the resumed noise of the table, "Thank you, Margaret. Not for the pie, They both knew it was not for the pie. Margaret nodded once and began cutting the next slice. The afternoon stretched out golden and slow, the way Christmas afternoons do, when the food has been good and the company has finally fully arrived at itself. Uncle Flavio cried during his second piece of apple pie, and swore as always that he had something in his eye. And as always, nobody believed him, and as always, everyone pretended to. The children, Renata's two, who had been at the kids' table in the adjoining room, and now migrated, as children do after dessert, into every available corner of the adult space, brought with them the particular chaos and brightness that only children bring, and the room expanded to hold them, the way this room had always expanded, the way Margaret had always made sure it could. Later, when the dishes were done, and the guests had gone and the house was settling into its quiet post-Christmas exhale, Dominic found his mother in the kitchen. She was wrapping the leftover turkey in foil, methodically the way she did everything. He stood in the doorway for a moment, just watching her, and then he walked in and stood beside her and picked up the roll of foil and held it for her while she tore pieces off, the way he used to do when he was a boy. They worked in silence for a while. Then he said, "Mom, I'm sorry." She did not stop what she was doing. She took the next piece of foil and pressed it around the dish and smoothed it down at the edges. Then she said, "I know you are." "I should have," he started, and then stopped, because the list of things he should have done was long and he didn't know where to begin, and she could see him drowning slightly in it. "Dominic," she said. She turned and looked at him. "You are a good son, and you are trying to be a good husband. Those two things got tangled up today. That happens. What matters is what you do next." He looked at her for a long moment. His father's eyes, her stubbornness. "How are you always like this?" he said. Not quite a question, more like something he needed to say out loud. She smiled, picked up the next dish. 31 years of practice, she said. He laughed, a real one, the kind that carries relief in it. And he stood beside her in the kitchen that smelled of everything she had made that day, and they wrapped the leftovers together. And outside the window the last of the Christmas light was going out of the sky in layers of pink and gold, and the house was quiet, and the table in the next room still held the faint, beautiful disorder of a meal that had fed a lot of people. Margaret looked at it through the doorway. Her table, her house, her Christmas. No one had taken it from her. No one ever could. Not really. Because what she had built in this house over 31 years was not made of furniture, or dishes, or tablecloths. As beautiful as those things were, it was made of something that does not respond to suggestions about eating upstairs. It was made of the particular and undefeatable substance of a woman who knows exactly who she is and where she belongs and what her presence at her own table means. And if you are sitting somewhere right now watching this, and you have ever been made to feel small in a space that was yours, if someone has ever tried to move you to the edges of your own life with a calm voice and a careful smile, then you already know what this story is really about. It is not about a chair. It is about the moment you stop letting anyone else decide whether you deserve to sit in it. Margaret untied her apron one last time that evening. She hung it on its hook. She turned off the kitchen light, and she walked unhurried through her house, and she was home.